I'm over here getting my moto fixed right now, so we over here waiting for a brief moment. Um, and I figured I'd go over some things that I saw yesterday that I wanted people to get a real understanding of because it's confusing, right? We were looking at a extra biblical document, the Book of Thomas, and trying to discern whether or not this is a book that is inspired or is it something that was put together, pieced together by by the Catholic Church or someone, not the Catholic Church, but someone who is around for the early church, and then yeah, even maybe later on the Catholic Church. But what it goes into deeper, if you want to look a little bit deeper into what's going on with it, it is definitely something that is crucial to understanding the New Testament text, because we see the New Testament text, as a document, but it's actually, several documents put together by several different authors that have the same sentiment. So, just for a little while, let me discuss here what's going on with Q. So, when we see people talk academically about the New Testament, they break it down into several different leading documents, right? Especially the Gospels. When they talk about the four Gospels, they talk about Matthew and Mark and Luke being what's called the synoptic Gospels, which all of those kind of work together and work in line with one another. And then you have John, which is kind of an outlier, which does different things, right? Tells different aspects of the same story. And there are some, places where some don't fit with the other, but that's what you would expect from a depiction coming from four different authors, right? So we see in the testimonies that Matthew, Mark, and Luke work together in such a way, right? So what they say, and this is what's crazy, is that Mark was the first book, and then Matthew and Luke depend on Mark and a hypothetical second book that we don't have called the Q document, right? And then the other thing that they say is that these were all written in Greek and that there's no Hebrew manuscripts, there's no Hebrew originals, that this is all Greek work, right? So let's kind of flesh that out a little bit. First of all, when they say the book of Mark was the very first book and all other books pulled from the book of Mark, it's really nonsensical, right? And it doesn't make sense where they draw this information from, because if it's the same information in all three books, then how in the world do you determine which one came first? They say literary analysis determines that, but there's no way to tell if you've got the same story three different times which one came first, besides somebody saying, hey, this one came first, this one came second, and this one came third. So any hypothesis about which book came first is just uh, it's just speculation, right? But what we do know is that the book of Mark is the shortest book of the New Testament, the shortest gospel in the New Testament, and the book of Matthew is the longest. So to say that the book of Mark spawned the book of Matthew, the shortest book spawning the longest book, is also just nonsensical. So these are things that we reject just offhand. And the reason why we are talking about this is because we watched a video last night from a quote unquote scholar, biblical scholar, and he's saying that the book of Mark, and I've heard all this before a long, long time ago, the book of Mark started all the Gospels, that Luke depends on Mark and that Matthew depends on Mark. And then not only just Mark, but also this. And if you guys are familiar with New Testament scholarship, they say that the original document was this document called Q, because in German and in Latin, that word for source starts with a Q. So they're saying the Q document, this mysterious Q document, is the document that everybody used to really start the New Testament, right? To start the New Testament understanding of the Gospels. That in itself is absolutely problematic because we know that that you can't start something you can't prove that a document that you don't have started all these other documents. How is that any sort of proof that this mysterious, unfound, unmentioned Q document, the Q document is not mentioned anywhere in history by any scholar, all the way up to the current era, but going backwards all the way to the very beginning, back to Yahushua's testimony, there is no reference anywhere of any Q document whatsoever from any church scholar, from any church father, from any disciple, from any testimony, anywhere. There is no Q document at all, right? And so we think to ourselves, why do people say that this Q exists if it clearly doesn't exist? And what it comes down to is that the Q document must be an old, not Q, but an old Hebrew original. And just so happens that that many church fathers, I was about to say most, but that many church fathers testified that they had or have known of an original Hebrew Matthew. Now, on the video that we watched last night, it was crazy because offhand he says, literary analysis says that even though these early church fathers attest to there being a Hebrew copy of Matthew, an original Hebrew Matthew, that quote unquote literary analysis says that must be impossible. So they've analyzed the words in Matthew, Mark, and Luke and supposed from these three documents that there was never a Hebrew original for the book of Matthew. It's completely ridiculous. And let me tell you why. So for one, many church fathers said that there was a Hebrew original. They mentioned Papias, which is a very early Christian church father, quote unquote church father. And he says that there was a Hebrew Matthew exist. And he said it obviously existed, right? That the ones that they have, the Greek copies that they have, were translations from the original Hebrew Matthew. And that just makes sense because you're talking about documents that come from a Hebrew people that were written to a Hebrew people. So they would be written in either Hebrew or Aramaic. Most likely Hebrew, because these are people who are looking for the authenticity of the text, right? And so you'll be writing in Hebrew as Matthew, someone who is familiar with the entire situation right from the beginning. He's going to write to his people in his people's language, the one that everybody would understand, recognize, and automatically give authority to, right? Because you remember in the book of Acts, when Paul starts speaking in Hebrew, everybody stands up and listens. Everybody starts to pay closer attention. So Matthew would have written in Hebrew. Mark would have written in Hebrew. Luke would have written possibly in Greek, but maybe also in Hebrew or Aramaic as well. We know Luke is writing to a guy named Theophilus, and so Theophilus is a Greek name, so it's more likely that he wrote in Greek, but all of the prior works would be Hebraic works because they're writing to a Hebraic culture. They're not writing to Gentiles, so they wouldn't be writing them in Greek, right? Especially very, very early on. Now, later on with the Pauline writings, there's a great opportunity for there to be Greek works. There's ample opportunity for there to be Greek understanding, right? We even know that Paul had scribes that he used to help him devise his writings in Greek. We know he spoke Greek. We don't know how well he wrote Greek. So in a lot of his books, he tells who the scribe is. Sometimes he writes the books himself, but in a lot of his books, he tells who the scribe is that helped him write the book, right? And so when we look at the book of Matthew, we look at it automatically in the Hebraic context. It has a genealogy in it. Since it has a genealogy in it, it's got to be written to people who would understand and see the significance of the genealogy. Even Luke has a genealogy in it. So the purpose of a genealogy is to reckon where people come from. And the only people that would care where people come from is people who are Hebraic already and know the prophecies prior to. And so that would matter to the Hebrew people, meaning that it must have been written to a Hebraic audience, meaning that it more than likely was in Hebrew. I'm talking about Luke right here, definitely Matthew. So one church father that said it was written in Hebrew first was Papias. Another church father writes the same thing. Not only does he write that, but he also says that he physically went to Jerusalem himself to see the copy of the Hebrew Matthew. And this is what is crazy to me, because on this documentary that I watched last night, they were saying that, oh, this one church father said that the book of Matthew was written in Hebrew first. But that's just not the truth, right? So you have very, very well-known church fathers. It's either Origen or Jerome. I'm thinking it's Origen, who literally went to Jerusalem himself with his Greek copy of Matthew, saying that he knows that the Hebrews in Jerusalem have the very earliest copies of Matthew, and they are in Hebrew, right? This is what Origen does. He gets his copy of his Greek Matthew, takes it on down to Jerusalem, and he even says that these scholars in Jerusalem have the only Hebrew copies left, that you can't get the Hebrew copy outside of Jerusalem of Matthew, that you have to go to Jerusalem to get it. And so that's what he does. He gets his Greek copy and goes to Jerusalem. And this is why we know that this Hebraic version of Matthew is true to life, because what Origen does is takes the two books and lays them side by side with each other and points out every place where the Hebrew Matthew is different from the Greek Matthew. See, this is the thing. You've got people thousands of years ago, or about 1700 years ago, that were, dumbfounded by the mysteries too, that were dedicated to solving these problems that we today are struggling with. So you have this early church father who says, I know that I don't have the original, and I want to know what the original says, and I want to know what it says different from what I have. And so he goes and he makes a copy of the differences. He doesn't make a whole copy of the text. I don't know if he was even allowed to make a whole copy of the text, but he makes a copy of the differences between the Hebrew and the Greek. And the only things that he writes down are the verses that are different. And so that's what has survived to the present day, his copy of the differences between the Greek Matthew and the Hebrew Matthew. And what he says, right, is amazing. For one, the rich man that says to Yahusha, he says, what must I do to earn eternal life? And then Yahusha turns to him and says, what does Moses say? And he says, well, honor thy father and mother, and, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill. All these things I've done since birth. And I think this Yahusha that says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. What does Moses say? What does the law say? And he said, I've done all these things since my birth, right? And so Yahusha starts quoting the 10 Commandments, right? And not all of them, just some of them. And then he says, of course, give up your riches and follow me. And the rich man doesn't do that. He's, upset. And then he goes on to say it's harder for a needle to fit through what does it say? It's harder for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, right? We know that. We know this story. Well, what Origen says, which is very important about the Hebrew Matthew that was different from the Greek, is that, for one, there were two rich men. And these two rich men approach Yahusha saying the same thing. What must I do to earn eternal life? Yahusha says directly, keep the law and the commandments. That's what Yahusha says. Keep the law and the commandments. And the two rich men say, we've done this our entire life. and say, okay, well, you've got one lacking thing. Give up your riches and follow me. Do you understand that it appears that somewhere in history, in an early stage, that Yahushua's words were edited, taken out of their original context, and put into a Christianized format, so whether they have, just a few commandments to keep: honor thy father and mother, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, and then besides that, believe on him. This is the Christian doctrine, right? That you don't have to worry about no law. They've taken that out, right? And so this is the significance of the Hebraic form of Matthew that Origen sought and that we are seeking today, right? And that's what's important to know about the document, that it's a Hebrew document and not a Greek one, coming from a Hebraic people, not a Greek people, right? And you can see the difference between the versions that we have, coming from the Greek people as opposed to coming from the Hebrew people. And so if you look, then you have, if we go back to the beginning, when we started talking about a document, a mysterious document that supposedly Greek Matthew, Greek Mark, and Greek Luke are all pulling from, right? This Q document. The Q document that is not substantiated anywhere in history, that we don't have any copies of, that is just a modern hypothesis for where this information comes from. We do have an ancient book that is now missing, the Hebrew Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, this Q document is non-existent, and they say it exists, but the Hebrew Matthew, the entire ancient world says exists, and they say it doesn't. And it's because of this information that's inside it that changes the whole doctrine of the Messiah, right? And so the Q document is actually Hebrew Matthew. And Hebrew Matthew is where all the other documents get all their information from. Hebrew Matthew is Q, right? No matter what anybody tells you, Hebrew Matthew is Q, right? Hebrew Matthew existed, and that is where the entire early church gained all of its information from, right? These are things we know. We can even look at the information that we have that's available now and figure these things out. And the fact that modern scholarship is pretending that these things don't exist is much more, everything cool? Is much more reason. Did you go ahead and change the oil for me? Yeah. And this is the reason why we know that that what we are doing and what we believe in is real. Because if it wasn't real, if these were Greek documents originally, then they would have nothing to change. It would be just straightforward that nothing would need to be changed at all in the documents. They wouldn't need to edit a document that they made themselves. So while people will go back and say, oh, okay, well, if the Matthew that I have is corrupted and some of the words of Yahushua are taken out of context, or some of the words are taken out altogether, then how can I trust, the Greek Matthew? How can I trust the Greek New Testament? How can I trust any of the Bible, right? If it's all in there together and it's been edited to even change the doctrine, how can I trust it? Well, the reason why you can still trust it is because it was edited. Do you see what I'm saying? Since it was edited, it means that the document is true, but this information within it, they want to keep hidden, or this information they want to control, right? So that means, so if you have a document that's false and you're trying to use it to control people, you're not going to need to change things around. You're not going to need to change languages, change names, change doctrines. You're going to keep it how it is. This is your document. You want to preserve it for what it is. Because if it's a psychological propaganda piece, then you're going to keep it exactly how it is. However, if it's not, if it's the real deal and you're using it out of its original context, you're going to change these specific things. You're going to change the name of the person that you worship from Yahushua to Jesus, Jesus after the Greek god Zeus. You're going to change the ethnicity of the person that you worship from a black Hebraic man to a white Greek, Greco-Roman, Eurasian figure. And then you're going to change the doctrine from following Yah, the commandments of Yah Elohim, to following the doctrines of man, to love thy neighbor. And what love thy neighbor means is be submissive and peaceful, not stir up any commotion or trouble. Submit to your oppression. Do you understand what I mean? Do you understand what I'm saying by that? This is the fact that it's edited. People would think that that means it's corrupted and I should throw it away. But this actually proves the significance of the text because ancient people were not only editing it, but also looking for the edits after it had been edited, right? It means the story is true and the documents are coded in such a way that they need to be decoded. You know, we know for a fact that we are meant to study. You know, what does the scripture say? Man, study to show thyself approved, right? This is what we do. This is what's necessary to understanding the text and to keep yourself from being confused. Because people will look and say, oh, if there's a Q document that I don't have that has all the sayings of Yahushua that I need, then we don't have that. So what am I studying the old things for, the ones that are just copies of? Or if, oh, these texts are edited and there is, you know, words that are missing, what am I studying this for? No, it's the wrong interpretation. These people know that this information is true and they're trying to keep it from you. Therefore, it's coded in such a way that the code can be cracked, because the devil is going to preserve the information somewhere because it's valuable information for him, right? Because he's got to know the plan too. But for you, you get the edited version so that you can, you know, not know the plan, right? But since the plan is available, since the plan is out there, you know, Yah has made a way for us to crack the code, right? Okay, you guys, that's really all I had. It was frustrating to see on this documentary last night, them just casually saying, "Oh, Q is the place where all the biblical gospels get their information from, and we don't have any evidence that it exists or any documentation whatsoever from any early church father or any disciple, apostle." And then also we have evidence for Hebrew Matthew, but we're rejecting that, right? It's clear that one represents the other. The made-up book that they are putting in place of Hebrew Matthew is Q, but it's just Hebrew Matthew, right, where they're getting their information from. So I'm just out here on the fly. I hope all that made sense to you guys. Let's see. Yep, we're right at 22 minutes here, so that's all I got, you guys. Shalom, shalom, family.